tears. Talk and angry words will do no good. We must fight. Sorely have our countrymen been dealt with, till forced to the declaration of their independence and the pledge of their lives and sacred honor to support it.
You are listening to Historyman, the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution, walk in the footsteps of heroes, and proclaim freedom reigns. On today's episode, we are featuring Robert Ryals, our friend, public historian, and reenactor, as he presents at the Native American Studies Center at the University of South Carolina-Lancaster on the wartime experiences of Reverend William Martin.
Not long after our arrival, I learned why the land grants in the backcountry were so generous. It was a dangerous place. A history of problems with Cherokee uprisings, roving bands of lawless men, problems ignored by the colonial assembly in Charlestown. And these problems forced prominent men in the backcountry to take matters in their own hands and regulate their affairs to establish peace and order. Many were embittered that the colonial assembly in the Low Country failed to provide them with support. Indeed, settling the backcountry was a risky proposition, but there was no turning back. This was our new home. And we were also aware of troubles brewing in the colonies, and word of the rebel takeover in the Low Country had reached our ears. The backcountry was divided in its political leanings, and this was especially true in the 96th District. Men like Thomas Fletcher, Thomas Brown, the Cunningham brothers, and Moses Kirkland were recruiting and organizing loyalists. These were the leaders of the regulator movement who distrusted the Low Country elites, who disregarded the problems for so many years of lawlessness in the backcountry. And these Low Country elites still dominated the politics of the colony, which was now in revolt. Nothing had changed. In 75, Reverend William Tennant, a member of the Provincial Congress in Charlestown, met with us and urged us to swear allegiance to defend this new rebel government. Mind you, he was an incredibly persuasive speaker. First, he preached from Mark 4 and 20 before hundreds who lived in our area. And then he apologized for having to bring up the subject of politics on the Lord's Day. But he emphasized the importance of it. He harangued us for quite some time, and by the end of his speech, he nearly melted from the heat. But his work bore fruit. Several men pledged their support. But despite his best efforts, the backcountry remained divisive. And it was only a matter of time before the tense divide between the partisan Whigs and Loyalists would lead to fighting in the 96th District. That fall, the Cunningham brothers captured a Patriot supply train of powder and lead in the 96th District. That supply of shot and powder was intended as a peace concession by the Provincial Congress for the Cherokee. And the partisan Whigs responded and captured a large number of Loyalists in December during the Snow Campaign. The problems with the Loyalists had been resolved. A lull in the fighting soon followed. Peace had been restored. Or so we thought. Little did we know that 75 was a temporary reprieve before the tempest. And truth be told, we simply wanted to be left alone. We wanted to live our lives in peace. I'll never forget that day. The 29th of May, 1780. That was the day when peace was shattered, and the horrific scene of that day would be etched in our minds for the rest of our lives. On that day, a regiment from Virginia, under the command of Colonel Abraham Buford, had been mercilessly cut down in the Waxhaws just off the road to Camden. It was a slaughter of men by the hand of Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton and his British Legion. 113 of Buford's men killed, another 150 wounded. A devastating sight to behold. Dead, pale faces, and the sounds and shrieks of dying men crying out for mercy and quarter, but got none. And Tarleton's reputation in the backcountry would forever be sealed as a cold-hearted murderer. Of course, this became the inescapable subject of the day and a reflection of the times that we faced. My friends and neighbors looked to me for guidance. After all, I was their spiritual leader, one of the most trusted men of the community. But what was I to do? I was a man of moral conviction and a man who faced internal conflict, caught between the desire of standing to fight or to flee in safety. I sought the wisdom of the ages and the Holy Spirit for guidance. It was the Sabbath, the 11th of June, not long after. And on that day, I would deliver the most important sermon in my life. I arose in the morning after a sleepless night, fasted and prayed to the Almighty for strength and guidance. And finally, the time had come. I mounted my horse and rode slowly along the winding footpath on the way to the meeting house. My thoughts were immersed in the content that I would preach that day. I stopped at the foot of the ridge and paused for a moment, and I squinted my eyes and saw the meeting house on the horizon, and the crowd was gathering, and I rode closer. Everyone in the Rocky Creek community and beyond had turned out. Not enough room in the meeting house for today's service. It would have to be held outdoors. With the hour of 11 o'clock drawn near, I came closer and recognized friends and neighbors in the crowd. Some gathered in small groups, standing tall and defiant. They were talking with loud and angry voices, stomping the ground as they spoke. Others were hunched over, speaking in hushed tones of melancholy, full of fear and apprehension. And the chorus of all their voices and incessant chatter drowned in my ears. And then there were the solitary figures, faces I didn't recognize. They were the ones that wore blank expressions, mouths silent, cold stares at the crowd, and cold stares at me. When I finally arrived, their faces turned and the crowd parted. Their voices began to calm and then recess to whispers. I dismounted from my horse. Not a whisper. Only the sound of rustling footsteps as people began to take their seats on the ground. And the elders retrieved the lectern for my use. We began with a prayer and a singing of the Psalms. And then I began the sermon, addressing the subject on the minds of everyone. I cited many passages from Scripture to show that a people may lawfully resist wicked rulers. I pointed to historical examples of princes trampling on people's rights. I painted in vivid colors the rise and progress of the Reformation. And finally, I introduced the subject of the Revolution in America. I gave a brief account of the events of the war from the first shedding of blood at Lexington up to our present circumstances. And at the end, I summarized my points and instructed them about what needed to be done. My hearers, talk and angry words will do no good. We must fight. Sorely have our countrymen been dealt with, till forced to the declaration of their independence and the pledge of their lives and sacred honor to support it. In preparing a discourse suited to this time of trial, I have sought for all light, examine the Scriptures and other helps in ancient and modern history, and have considered especially the controversy between the United Colonies and the mother country. Our forefathers in Scotland made a similar pledge as sacred honor to support their independence. And they maintained that declaration with their lives. It is now our turn, brethren, to maintain this fight at all hazards. Go see the tender mercies of Great Britain at the Waxhaw Meeting House. In that church, you may find men, though still alive, hacked out of the very semblance of humanity. Some men deprived of their arms, mutilated trunks, some with one arm or leg, and some with both legs cut off. Is not this cruelty a parallel to the history of our own Scottish forefathers who were driven from their conventicles and hunted down like wild beasts? My brethren, we must fight! Hands and teeth were clenched at the end of the sermon, and every face expressed the same determination. Captain Benjamin Land was seen walking about, shaking hands and passing the word to the men. They were to meet and assemble at the muster grounds. They would form a company of militia and fight. We were all united in the spirit of the moment. Or so I thought. Unknown to many of us, there were loyalists in our midst. These were the silent ones with cold, hard stares, and they would betray our efforts. They had already betrayed others in our neighborhood, including Reverend John Simpson, pastor of the meeting house at Fishing Creek. Simpson, too, had encouraged members of his congregation to join the resistance, and he himself had taken up arms in the militia. And on the same day that I was delivering my sermon, a detachment of British cavalry arrived at Simpson's home. Their intent was to arrest him. But not finding him there, they burned his home, his library, and meeting house out of spite. His wife and children were left homeless. This was unknown to me at this time. On the next day, the Monday, the day after my sermon, men from the congregation gathered as instructed and began to drill. And suddenly, there was the sound of thundering hooves, and a detachment of New York volunteers under the command of Captain Christian Huck appeared. They wore callous and cruel expressions and held their shining sabers high in the morning light. The men scattered looking for cover, but found none, and all were cut down like Buford's men. And then this merciless band rode to George Harris's blacksmith shop nearby, and they killed 6 more. And then they came for me. They came to my home, arrested me, threw me in irons, threw my wife and daughter out of our house, plundered it, burned it, and burned my meeting house to the ground, leaving nothing behind but smoke, ash, and ruin. I was taken to Rocky Mount and then to Camden, where I spent the next 6 months of my life, held in chains like a felon. And at the end of the year, I and other prisoners of war were marched north to Winnsboro, the winter encampment of Lord Cornwallis. We all faced a court-martial, most likely a death sentence for us all. We were kept under guard when we arrived, and the first day passed, and then the second, and it seemed like an eternal wait, time in limbo. Our fate came at the noon hour on a cold and dreary day in January. I was kneeling in prayer with Lieutenant Minor Wynne behind a woodpile, and our prayer was interrupted by the sound of a soldier's footsteps. He stopped in front of me. I looked up and saw the scowl on his face. He bent down, grabbed my arm, and said, "Get up, old man," and then hoisted me up from the cold, cold ground. I resisted the urge to strike him. Nothing good would come from it at this point. The other men got the same rough treatment, and we were marched in a column across the camp. And soldiers heckled and spit upon us as we walked by. Then the column turned to the left, and I saw it. The gallows across the other side of the camp, and a noose swinging in the breeze. And for a brief moment, I thought about my dead, lifeless body swinging from the hangman's noose, and my grieving family cutting me down. We continued our march and then stopped in front of the command tent of Lord Cornwallis, and then shuffled inside. I was the first to be presented before his lordship, the first to be sentenced. The guards pushed me forward, and there he was, the mighty Cornwallis, a mighty Goliath, cloaked in an old red English coat, stained with the blood of our kinsmen and countrymen. A man of war. He was seated at his desk, writing a letter, and he deliberately ignored me and continued his business, making the wait seem like an eternity. And then he finally set his quill down, rubbed his eyes, looked up at me, and glowered. He gave me a long, hard stare and then spoke. "You are charged with preaching from the pulpit. You, an old man and a minister of the gospel of peace, with advocating rebellion against your lawful sovereign, King George III. What have you to say in your defense?" What could I say in this matter? He was my judge, jury, executioner, and he held the fate of my mortal life in his hands. I quickly gathered my thoughts and kept my pride and hubris in check. But in my final hour, I needed to convey the truth of my sentiments as a Covenanter, and I replied, "Your Lordship, I am happy to appear before you. For these past 6 months, I have been held in chains for preaching what I believe to be the truth. As to King George, I owe him nothing but goodwill. I am not unacquainted with his private character. I was raised in Ireland, educated in the Scottish literary and theological schools, and settled back in Ireland, where I spent the prime of my days and immigrated to this country 7 years ago. As a king, he was bound to protect his subjects in the enjoyment of their rights. Protection and allegiance go together hand in hand, and when the one fails, the other cannot be exacted. The Declaration of Independence is but a reiteration of what our covenanting fathers have always maintained. I am thankful you have given me the liberty to speak, and will abide by your pleasure, whatever it may be." Cornwallis paused for a moment, and it seemed he was about to issue his sentence. And then a local provincial officer named Colonel John Phillips bent down and began to whisper in his lordship's ear. Phillips was a Tory by conviction, but he was a fair-minded man, a man of principle and education, and a man who had been born in Ireland. And for some reason, his lordship favored him. He advised his lordship in a respectful tone to take caution. For if I and the others there were to be executed, then the local Whigs of the Fairfield district would surely hang 100 of His Majesty's subjects in retaliation. Cornwallis paused again, and the countenance on his face changed. And instead of a death sentence, we were all given parole. Phillips had saved us all. I was exiled to live with the other hornets in the nest in the county of Mecklenburg. And it is here, my friends, that I must add that God works in the lives of men who show and commit acts of benevolence. For the next year, Phillips himself had been captured and condemned to the gallows by the Whigs at Camden. But the Whigs of the Fairfield district remembered Phillips's actions on that day, sparing the lives of their countrymen. They petitioned on his behalf, and like me, he survived from certain death and was banished from South Carolina. After the war, I returned to South Carolina and was reunited with family and friends. I continued to preach the gospel in my covenanting traditions, and I certainly wasn't a perfect man. I developed intemperate habits after the war and into my old age, and as a consequence, lost the following of many members of my flock. But I continued to preach those who would listen. And then in the year 1807, I took a fall from my horse. And as I lay dying at the age of 77, thoughts of my life rushed through my mind. Life in Ireland, our journey to America, our life in South Carolina, the first wife I lost in Ireland, and my beloved wife and daughter. And finally, I closed my eyes for the last time and slowly drew in the last breath of my mortal life. And I let out a final sigh and entered into eternal peace. And now, my friends, I too must depart. You have been patient hearing the ramblings of a long-deceased man from a time both strange and unfamiliar. I will conclude by saying that I was not a perfect man. My heart was full of pride and hubris and vengeance and temperate habits. But I was devoted to my flock and to my covenanting faith to the end. And the dust of my bones has settled in the native soil of my new home country of South Carolina. Thank you.